Good evening. Welcome to the Budget and Revenue Task Force meeting. It's Wednesday, April 17, 2019. If we don't know that date, we're in trouble. But what I'd first like to do before we get to the first agenda item is just go around the table and introduce ourselves. I'm Diane Mahan, Chair of the Select Board.
Cindy Friedman, State Senator, Arlington.
Marie Patel, Board Administrator.
John Hurd, Select Board.
Dan Dunn, Select Board.
Tracy Ellison-Ampe, immediate as Chair of the School Committee and now Chair of Budget.
Michael Mason, Arlington Public Schools CFO.
Steve Rocker, State Representative.
Ellen Rose, Vice President.
Joe Carroll, Select Board. Steve DeCoursey, Select Board.
Al Tosti, FinCom.
Sandy Pooler, Deputy Town Manager.
Adam Chaplain, Town Manager.
Thank you very much.
Should we have the finance team?
Good. Phyllis.
Oh, it is. Sorry.
Paul Taney, Director of Executive. Doug Masson, Town Council.
And we have,
Joseph Thomas.
and also Bob.
Oh, Bob Sprang, you're Arlington.
Thank you for being here. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Because we do have such a full agenda, I'm going to turn the first agenda item over to our Town Manager and Deputy Town Manager, Mr. Chapdelaine.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. So the first thing we want to do tonight is update the group on our long-range plan. And we're going to have, Sandy's going to do that, but I think everybody in the room knows what we're going to talk about tonight has really been the culmination of, frankly, years, but certainly more intensely over the past couple months, work by a lot of people to come up with a long-term plan based on a number of different factors. So we want to walk through a long-range plan scenario as it is and as is being recommended to town meeting. And then we also want to walk through a long-range plan scenario that incorporates an override that I know the board will be considering at its meeting after this meeting tonight. There's also a further sheet that has three scenarios of what that override might look like. So I think what might be best is if Sandy wants to walk through the sheet that has the green color on top.
So it's a big sheet like this. And so this is the usual long-range financial plan where we start with the FY20 budget and then work forward and just look at the fundamentals of the town budget. This plan is based on the numbers that come from the state budget proposal that came out of the House Ways and Means Committee last week. They released their budget on Tuesday. We got the final numbers that incorporated not only new state aid figures, but also new assessment figures, because the state giveth and the state taketh away at the same time. So we initially saw a boost in Chapter 78 out of the House Ways and Means Committee budget. Once we saw the final assessments, we also saw that our charter school assessments went up about $40,000 more than the governor's budget. So there was a net increase between the governor's budget and this budget of about $122,000. Overall, Arlington has done well in this budget. We have an increase overall of state aid of about $3.4 million. I think most of that comes from our Chapter 78, and most of that is because we've seen changes in the foundation budget that are finally really reflecting both the costs of Arlington's educating our students and the enrollment growth we've seen over the years. And so that's been, we've been very fortunate, and actually compared to a lot of communities, we're one of the big winners in that regard under the governor's and the House's formulas. So that's been quite positive. Just to reiterate, I know a lot of you have seen some of these, but I'll touch briefly on it. During the long-range planning committee meetings this year, we also adjusted our local receipts estimates. We really boosted both our motor vehicle excise estimates and, to some extent, our licenses and permits, our building permit estimates, to add $700,000. Usually we assume that those receipts are going to go up $100,000 a year, so that was a fairly big boost. And the property taxes are based on the usual assumptions that we make from time to time. With new growth going up, we assume $650,000 this year. I think the important number to look at on this sheet is use of the override stabilization fund, where we need to pull out $2.4 million, almost $2.5 million from the override stabilization fund in order to balance the FY 2020 budget. That means that we are now in the second year in a row of having to use the override stabilization fund. If you look at the next year, FY 2021, you see that use goes up significantly from $2,475,000 to almost $8 million. And then it goes up to $12 million a year after that. And then basically we run out of money in the override stabilization fund. We have a little bit left in 2023, but we also still have a $14.7 million deficit. The spending side on this budget reflects a consensus, I think, that was reached at the Long Range Planning Committee and was approved by the Finance Committee to adjust the numbers that we use to allocate money to the school budget and to take account for new enrollment. For several years, the town had given and accounted for in the school budget looking at the average cost to educate a student and allocating 35% of that to the school budget for enrollment growth. These figures here now start to allocate 50% for each new student. And so that leads to a boost in the school budget of about $500,000 just from that. The rest of the things are all pretty straightforward. I know a lot of you have heard these numbers before, so I'm not going to go through each and every line unless there are questions about those. Everything is pretty much in line with the long-range plan, the town budget going up by 3.25%, the capital budget being 5% of the overall budget, our pensions going up as in accord with what we hear from the retirement board. Our health insurance numbers are based on the latest numbers, the final numbers from the GIC and their enrollment and their rates. And we have a balanced budget. The one other thing that I would note, which again, if members of the Long Range Planning Committee are aware of, one of the things that we've done here in the Override Stabilization Fund is assume that there will be a $2.5 million deposit into the Override Stabilization Fund from overlay surplus. And last night, the assessors did vote to release both the normal $200,000 that they put into the operating budget every year, plus $2.5 million into overlay surplus. They've declared that. That's now available for appropriation, and at town meeting it will be then appropriated into the Override Stabilization Fund. And just finally wrapping up, the most important thing to note here is that we do have a deficit in FY23 that's quite significant and then continues to grow after that. So with that, I will stop and ask for any questions about this forecast, and then I have another forecast that shows the effect of an override and some spending increases.
Mr. Dunn?
So just to be clear, or just make sure I understand that. So for this coming year's budget, the two biggest variables remain what the state actually passes with the budget and what our actual insurance experience will be. Are those the two biggest, or am I missing anything?
So the insurance experience right now is locked in, so we know that.
Okay.
So
So down to one.
So now, yes, and so then the issue is going to be what happens in the state senate with Chapter 70. There's a lot of discussion going on about how to restructure the Chapter 70 program. And there's the governor has a plan, the House has a plan, the Senate has a plan. And I think everybody recognizes that the Chapter 70 program needs to be revisited. I'm sure there are other people in the room who can speak more eloquently and knowledgeably about what's going on at the State House. But I think it is also a strong sign that both the governor and the House have put significant money toward Chapter 70 in the history of the Commonwealth. That usually means that we can count on those kind of increases. And there may be tweaking in the Senate. We don't know yet. We won't know for about another month. But I think we certainly know that we're in I would say, a comfortable range unless something dramatic changes.
Thank you.
I just have a quick question, and it's a very non-controversial line item, but I know in years past, under the Municipal Building Insurance Trust Fund, I think we had utilized some of those funds in previous years. Are we still doing that, or we're going to let it start to build back up, or something else?
So we take, when we've needed to use it, we've done an appropriation to pay for damage to buildings or to pay for the deductible of damage to buildings. But with built into the line D or row D, the insurance line, it doesn't show there, but we take $20,625, it's a number that's been in place for a decade or more, offset insurance costs with that by taking it out of that fund. But so what you see in the bottom is that it's coming out, but there's also interest going in on top of that, so there's still a net increase in the fund. But we do use a little bit of it to offset property insurance on a year-over-year basis.
Okay. Any other questions on this, or comments? If not, we'll move on.
All right.
Mr. Pooler?
Thank you. So the other sheet is all black and white. This is not like the Wizard of Oz or anything.
Yeah, he's going to say, colored of black and white.
Right.
I got it.
It's because when I was printing this stuff, I ran out of toner in our color machine, so I had to switch to a black and white machine. But it helps us also distinguish between the two plans. So this one has all the same revenue assumptions built in, with one major exception, and that is that this builds in a $5.5 million override. It's happening this June, and that would start to affect the FY 2020 budget. Going hand in hand with that assumption of a successful override are increases both to the school budget of $600,000 in FY 20, an additional $600,000 in FY 21, then $800,000 over and above that in 22, and an additional $800,000 in FY 23. There's also an increase of $250,000 on the town side budget. So these are to both enhance programming and meet needs that the school department and the school committee have identified, and on the town side, to deal particularly with certain mobility and transportation issues, particularly as they affect some of our elderly citizens, but to try to really comprehensively deal with these as a community and to help our residents. So with that, assuming that we have this override, the override is successful, then that puts off an override for 4 years. It means that we can go between now and FY 2024 before we would face the need for another override. At that point, there would be a significant deficit, $17.8 million. But it would be in keeping with the practice in the past to set out an override and set a number of years going forward for how long that override would last. Again, those are really the only changes between this and the previous plan, the override increase and some increased spending on both the school and town sides. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
The only thing I would add is many of us around the table, the last time we saw this, and I think even most recently the select board looking at this, saw projections of a $5.6 million override. But with the House budget numbers coming out last week, we were about $120,000 better than the governor's budget, as Sandy mentioned. We'd be able to do all of the same things that members of the select board had brought forth to the board, but for $5.5 million instead of 5.6.
I have a question just because I want to make sure I understand this, and I probably don't. When I look at the 4-year $5.5 million override, FY '19, I see that we use, and it's the same number in our long-range plan, 2.7 million.
Mhm.
And then the following year, that deposit, is that if from a successful override, or is that from the current override stabilization fund?
So that deposit means that because we have an override, and because we are putting that $2.5 million in from the overlay, that we end up, the size of the override stabilization fund goes up 4.6, almost $4.7 million. About half of that increase is because of the increased money from the overlay that the assessors declared, and about half of it is the result of having an override. So we have more money, and we can start to fill those coffers again for 1 year before we then have to start drawing them down again.
And I guess, again, my apologies, just to reconcile, all the other figures before and after that, basically, we're using money from the override stabilization fund. And my question is, are we not using any money FY '20 from the override is that 2.7 million? So that number is 4.6 minus 2.7, or no? 2.7 comes out from the pre-existing, and then if there's a successful override, it's 4.6.
So
Go ahead, Ed.
And I may be,
no,
clarify how I should read that.
That's a great question.
So if the override is successful, no money will need to come out of the override stabilization fund in FY '20.
Okay.
And as part of the operating budget, 2.174510 will go in, plus 2.5 million from the overlay surplus, which adds up to the 4.674510 that's on this scenario sheet. So all of that money will go in, but then will need to start being withdrawn upon in FY '21.
So even though it says it's just a deposit, we will be using some of the now combined override stabilization fund under the appropriate formula.
In future years, yeah.
Future
FY
years.
'20
Okay,
is
okay.
not FY '21 and beyond.
Sorry,
yes.
I apologize, I get it now.
No, no.
Any questions or comments? I guess not. Okay. Oh, I see Len Carden, our colleague from the school committee. Thank you so much. Sorry that I missed you. I guess what we should do is, we discussed the override. Oh, Mr.
Yeah,
Dunn.
I guess I would be remiss if I didn't say something, because this is obviously one of the biggest deals, one of the biggest things that we as a town have to tackle. And I guess part of it, in some ways I'm kind of glad that no one has any discussion, that no one really had any immediate discussion about it, because it says that we really did have a really rich conversation leading up to this, which we have. The number of long-range planning meetings, the number of select board meetings, the number of finance committee meetings, the number of town meetings where we talked about what it is to live within a constrained, where our revenue is constrained smaller than our expenses. And so I'm really happy with the commitment, the draft plans that the select board has looked at in previous meetings that I believe we're going to adopt in some form in our meeting in an hour. And it's, this is the first operating override we've done in 8 years. And in some ways, I think of this as like the next chapter for the town. We did a 5-year override, and then we did, it lasted 6 years. And then we did a 3-year override that's really managed the last 8. And so this is going to be a 4-year override, and I'm not going to say how long it lasts, but I'm sure it's going to last 4. And I can only hope that it lasts longer.
And we have a good proven track record. Before I call on the senator and representative, do any of you all have a question or comment? Senator Friedman, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
Did you have anything you wanted to?
I'm here for you. So I don't know if you have questions. I mean, we haven't done our budget yet. Just one thing I want to just clarify is we have not changed the foundation budget yet. That's what we'll be doing, and hopefully there'll be agreement, but that's to come, and I think it's going to be happening later in the session.
Yeah.
So, so there's more to come. I think just speaking on the Senate side around local aid in Chapter 70, that there is a very strong commitment to try and increase all of these numbers, both in Chapter 70, the sped, the circuit breaker, charter schools, but to see the Senate is looking at seeing how they can increase that funding while we figure out how to change the budget, the foundation formula. So I know that that's going on right now in the Senate in Ways and Means, that discussion. I think there's been a fairly direct communication from the Senate president saying we really want to try and do something, before we actually tackle the foundation formula. And I know that in talking to my counterparts in the House, that I think the House also is looking to do that, something, but I think they felt a little differently in terms of how much to do in the budget right now. So I know there'll be negotiations, but I think that that's where the Senate is right now. So we're still talking and we'll see, but.
It's a good segue. Thank you, Representative Godley. Any comments?
I know Representative Rogers is here as well.
Yes, Al.
Yeah, we
Do you want, does it,
Well, so I could, our budget just came out, and it's a good budget for Arlington, especially in Chapter 70. UGA stays the same from the governor's recommendation of House 1. I would echo the senator's comments. There is a strong commitment in the House to adopt all the provisions of the Foundation Budget Review Commission. I think there are some differences around the charter school piece. I think right now the House's intention is to do that separate from the Foundation Budget Review Commission, but still do that this term. But I think we believe it's important to do those separate. We'll see if that happens. But I know there's a strong commitment to do all 4 pieces of Foundation Budget Review Commission this term. Obviously, Arlington is very impacted around healthcare and around special education. And those actually were included in the House package last term. We couldn't get to an agreement with the Senate at the end of the session, but there have been robust conversations, I know, behind the scenes and with the 2 committee chairs, Jason Lewis on the Senate side and Alice Peisch on the House side, to try to come to an agreement. So I feel very confident that we're going to get there. It's just going to probably be after the House does their budget and probably after the Senate does theirs as well.
Representative Rogers?
Yeah, well, it's great to be here.
Thank you.
And commend all of you for, I know, the intense amount of planning that goes into this process. And I will tell you, as an aside, I met with the Citizens Housing Group that's working on a municipal engagement project with Arlington on some of these proposed zoning amendments that are on the warrant. And it's funny, there were 3 individuals that came to meet with me, and they all complimented Arlington on the quality of the staff and the personnel who work in this town. And I think it's worth saying that, because I think the quality of leadership in the town is pretty remarkable. And I would mostly just echo what Senator Friedman and Representative Garland said. I think the House budget was good. It's great on Chapter 70 for Arlington. I think it's a bump up on Community Preservation Act, which is overdue. I mean, it was sort of a victim of its own success. As more and more towns join the CPA, there's less and less of the pie to be divided up, and that's been a persistent problem, so there's an effort to boost that. METCO funding got a nice bump this year, which is significant and important. The House did have some new revenue, and I think this is really the first term I've served where I think there's some prospect we're going to do something significant on revenue. The question will be, was it going to be in the budget or a separate discussion? And I think the Speaker of the House just yesterday on radio, I believe it was, said he was open to a discussion about revenue outside of the budget. So I think there's some hope. We're going to advance the millionaire's tax. Obviously, that failed because the Supreme Judicial Court said that it was improperly, sort of a legal technicality. But the House is committed to move it again so that we can try to take that approach to revenue. But I think other ideas will be on the table. I think to what Senator Friedman and Representative Garbely said, you know, with trying to fix the foundation budget, it costs money. I mean, the millionaire's tax was geared to go toward transportation and education. So if we don't have that revenue, how do we fund improvements to the foundation budget, which everyone agrees is misstates the amount of funding needed. So I think there's just a ton of energy to work on this right now. So many members on the House side, and I'm sure on the Senate side, are galvanizing around this. I've given up predicting what will happen in the legislature because there are things I predicted would almost certainly happen that didn't. There have been things that I didn't necessarily think that would happen that did. So it's impossible to predict, but I'll kind of go out on a limb that I would be almost just shocked if we don't do something on the foundation budget this term. We came so close last time. I think there was some consternation and folks focused on the fact that we didn't get it over the finish line. But the flip side of that, the positive thing is look how far it got. It got to very advanced stages of negotiations between the House and Senate. And so, and there are legitimate debates on both sides of the way either part of our bicameral legislature wanted to handle it. So I think there's just tremendous energy. I think there's goodwill to get it done, and I'm very hopeful that we're going to see significant education reform this term, the biggest since 1993, when the last huge education reform. So, but as also as Senator Friedman said, you know, I'm here for you, and this doesn't have to be obviously a one-time meeting. I hope and trust we'll be following up with additional conversations.
Definitely. Any questions, comments? My one question would be of either Mr. Chapdelaine, Mr. Tosti, Mr. Dunn, and Mr. Cardin. Should we set a May meeting, a budget revenue task force, or should we wait and see if we need it?
Setting another meeting, you said? Or what was the question?
Yeah,
Setting another meeting.
do I need to have in my head, or should it be, unless I hear from somebody on the task force, I won't be looking to set a May date?
I suppose the only reason to consider calling one would be if there was a major change in the Senate budget as compared to what we've seen. So perhaps we could wait to see the Senate's budget.
Okay.
And if necessary, call a meeting, and if not, just carry on as we've planned.
Does that sound good to everybody? I'll take a motion to adjourn by Mr. Tosti, seconded by...
Well, actually, I wanted to say
sorry.
something.
Oh, yes. Oh, sorry.
I think that the town of Arlington would like to express its appreciation to the governor, if he was here. And I'd like to express our appreciation to Sean and to David and the House Ways and Means Committee for the increase in the revenues. And I look forward to extending the same thing to the senator.
Mr. Cardin.
Yes. So to the delegation, the question is there anything we can do as a community to help with these efforts? We've already passed a resolution over a year ago, so, you know, that the school committee is supporting the effort, we can pass that again. We haven't endorsed a particular bill because we're not first with the details of the various alternatives that are in front of you. But is there anything that we should be doing as a community to help this along that we're not doing?
Well, don't be too happy about the increases, okay? Because, you know, I mean, they're good, but they're, you know, it's still going to be a struggle. And it's great to have the money, but we haven't really addressed the fundamental issue, which is around how the foundation, how the budget is, what the formula is. So, you know, I think a lot of the back and forth is how much structural change do we need and when. And I think everybody wants to give, you know, wants to fund education, but it's how much and when. So, I mean, I'm kind of being a little facetious, but I'm also a little serious in that you need to be clear that this is helpful, but it isn't, it sort of does not meet the cost of educating students in the Commonwealth. And, you know, some of this money you would have gotten anyway, just by the, you know, the sort of yearly increases that we do, which are not, you know, so I think just, you got to keep the pressure on, because, you know, you are not out of the woods. And as we all know, Arlington is, you know, one of what, now 26 communities that's sort of, you're landlocked. And so you need all that you can get, at least on this education side, to keep your schools running. And you don't have the ability to go out and, you know, build new buildings and get commercial revenue, and, you know, so I would just ensure that you know, you're very nice and you thank us very much, but you need to keep the pressure on. I really believe that.
Representative.
So I agree completely. Senator Len, I think the school committee, the Board of Selectmen has done an amazing job in conveying to our constituents how important this is, to each of the respective boards. They have certainly conveyed the importance to us. I also think it's important, as Senator Friedman mentioned, keeping the pressure on, also keeping the pressure on to organizations like MMA, you know, the MASC, MASS, to make sure that they advocate as well on Beacon Hill on behalf of the town of Arlington. I feel, you know, I do feel very good about the recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission. I do agree with Senator Friedman in terms of, you know, the recommendations came out 5 years ago, right? The costs of ELL, healthcare, special ed, all the areas have only gone up in the last 5 years. So we know the needs are more than the recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission. But there is goodwill and a strong belief that we can get this done this term on both sides. Senator Friedman's absolutely right in terms of what the differences are. You know, both bills, or, you know, there's several bills floating around, but I believe that the House and the Senate are anywhere from 70 to 75% in agreement. The question, at least I'm not speaking on behalf of the delegation, just myself, I think the difference really comes around timeline and some of those other issues. But I would say keep the pressure on, contact those organizations as well on behalf of municipal government to keep your perspectives alive on Beacon Hill as well. So.
Mr. Carroll? Oh, Mr.
I think it was well stated
Did
by
you,
my
I'm sorry.
colleagues, so
Are you sure? I was waiting for a hand, I'm sorry.
I think I associate myself with their remarks. I mean, I could essentially say the same thing, but I don't want to take your time. I think it was remarkably well stated, and I agree to continue strong advocacy, continue to push through different organizations, the MMA and others. And
Mr. Carroll?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'd be remiss if we didn't know, or we have our delegation here, that, you know, as we approach this decision this evening, putting this override on the ballot, that it is, you know, lack of state revenue, lack of those growth opportunities and other revenue sources that does force us to go back to the property tax, which, as we all know, is regressive. We're very cognizant of the impacts on some of our vulnerable population. So part of the commitments that I expect we'll adopt this evening are forwarding initiatives to relieve some of the pressure on income eligible seniors. And part of that package includes, we recorded out home rule legislation around municipal circuit breaker, although it mirrors some other legislation that I understand is already in play from the Massachusetts Association of Assessors. So we really need our delegation support on those measures as well as we go forward to the voters, because those are commitments that we can make, but we can't really consummate them without legislative support. So.
Yep, good, yeah. I know on the deferred tax, deferred property taxes, I know we did some work with you all about lowering that interest rate, and I know we have a little more work to do on ensuring that there's a year grace period for people to to resolve their probate and make the sale, and so we will continue to push that,
Yeah,
that piece too. And then I know there's some changes to the circuit breaker though.
yeah.
So yeah, we will continue.
Any further comments? I would, on behalf of my colleagues on the Budget and Revenue Task Force, really thank our Town Manager, Adam Chapdelaine, and Deputy Town Manager, Sandy Pooler, on, once again, a concise, extensive, kind of small font. But that's not, that can't be unless we all have long people. But I don't want to diminish from, this was a great presentation for everybody around this table, as well as anybody who's viewing this or will view it in the future. And for someone like me to actually be able to read about 75–80% of this and get it, that's a huge task to overcome. So I don't want that to go without being noted, because, and that's what we come to expect, and that's what we always get. So with that, I'll take a motion to adjourn from Mr. Tosti, seconded by,
Second.
was that you, Mr. Kiro? All those in favor say aye. All those opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you.